Helping someone can so easily become a habit for both parties, and people are often more comfortable being the helper than the helped. Peter had always said that Hungry Paul was Helen's sunfish. Years ago, before they had kids, Helen and Peter visited the aquarium in Monterey, California. A preference for aquariums over zoos was one of the early examples of how the Venn diagram of their personal tastes often overlapped in idiosyncratic ways. Among the lithe coral reef sharks, alien jellyfish and camouflage rays was what looked like a floating, severed head. A large, lopsided, sideways swimming fish with reflective skin and a slightly lost expression on its face. It was a sunfish, and Helen said it was her favourite. Peter looked at her when she said this. He looked at the concentrated sincerity on her face. Now, usually, he would tease her about being willfully alternative in her choices, but even he knew this was a very personal moment. Though she didn't say so, he realised that she had picked the sunfish as her favourite because she knew nobody else would pick it. It would have pained her beautiful heart to think that there was a living thing that would go through life unloved, and she was compensating for that with a special, deliberate effort to love it. In the same way, when her son was born after 2 miscarriages and almost didn't make it, she had promised that if he survived, she would not expect or ask any more from him for his whole life than that. And that is why she had accepted Hungry Paul as he was and let him follow his natural, meandering course through life as her sunfish. Peter's own father had died when he was only 9, and he had grown up without really knowing how boys and men were supposed to act. So he had always held back and looked inwards rather than trying to project his own unsure version of himself onto the world. When Helen was pregnant with Grace, they didn't find out the sex of the baby before the birth, and Peter carried an uneasiness throughout that time that it might be a boy. He had barely enough maleness to get him through his own life, never mind imparting it to his son. When Grace was born, he felt relieved that he would at least get some practice as a parent before having to face raising a boy. When Hungry Paul was born, there was little time for abstract problems, as the first few weeks were full of worry and sleeplessness. Later at school, Hungry Paul always seemed a vulnerable child who was small for his age and had few friends. Peter continually worried that his son would get bullied. This vicarious vulnerability made Peter feel guilty. Was he worried about Hungry Paul, or just worried about himself, that he wouldn't know how to handle it if his child was being victimised? When Hungry Paul left school, perhaps Peter could have done more to help him find a job that he was good at. He had an aptitude for science and he could think well, but he just had no ideas when it came to a career. But Peter had let Hungry Paul find his own way, or, to be accurate, find no particular way at all. As his father, Peter had a nagging sense that through some paternal means unknown to him, man-to-man chats or fishing trips maybe, he should have prepared Hungry Paul for the world a little better. When Hungry Paul was brought home from the hospital, Helen and Peter made a big fuss of Grace, about how she was his big sister and what an important job that was. A few years later, when Hungry Paul started school, Helen had a formal chat with Grace about the duties and responsibilities that fell to the older sister of someone like her brother. Grace had taken these conversations seriously. She was just as keen to be a model daughter as she was to be a model sister. Without anything further being said, and without her ever deliberately deciding anything, Grace had seamlessly continued to act as Hungry Paul's guardian angel through to secondary school and on into both their adulthoods. In fact, she had never even considered whether the duties assigned to her as a young girl had ever been lifted. As she planned her own wedding and looked ahead to her marriage, she began to question whether she could move on to a new life without letting go of her old one. She found herself encouraging her parents to make Hungry Paul more independent and to become more independent themselves. Somewhere at the back of her busy mind, she wondered who would look after Hungry Paul when they were gone, if he couldn't look after himself. The thought of that role falling to her, she was the only realistic candidate for it, panicked her. She didn't want to become frozen in time with the boy she first met at the age of 3. So she set about making other plans, committing herself to Andrew as a way of relinquishing her duty towards Hungry Paul. And so, with such deep undercurrents causing undetected ripples at the surface, 3 people who loved each other very much and who loved Hungry Paul very much chatted over an Italian meal about the details of their lives.